Okay, so good morning. Thank you for joining this second technical training on the European data space for smart communities. This is the idea for today. We will start by recapping a little bit the previous technical session because we tackle different aspects from the technical perspective of the data space blueprint in the last technical session a couple of weeks ago, and then after the last session, you were indicating some questions and concerns, some ideas about how to approach the deployment of the blueprint and the validation of the blueprint. So we will be analyzing and discussing these feedback and questions that you provided last time. And then I will present you some insights that I have observed from the analysis of your pilot's profile, in concretely from your data cooperation canvas and from your contract proposal. And then we can comment and we can try to extract a kind of mapping between what you are thinking, what you are having currently at your legacy systems, and the building blocks and the components that we are proposing from the blueprint. So in this way, we can envisage where we are as a starting point, as a baseline, and which is the path that every data space, every pilot has to going through. And finally, we would like to collect also which are your proposals for upcoming trainings, because we have still the opportunity in January to have additional training sessions for more specific or concrete topics that you are interested in. So we will manage to do all of this in these 2 hours that we have. So the idea is that from the recap onwards, the session would be quite interactive. So it's more discussion session than a purely speaking session. So don't hesitate to jump and to interrupt wherever is needed. Okay. So then let's start by recapping the previous technical sessions. I grant or I credit my colleague Timo for some of the presentations that he provided you in the last technical session as well. So we started to explaining you what is more or less the approach that we have taken with the European data space for smart communities. The idea is to federate the data spaces that were coming from local and national, regional point of view. And we are assuming that these data spaces are leveraging on the existing current platforms at the cities, at the regions, at the countries. So we are upgrading these platforms, evolving these platforms to become a data space to acquire the features that are required for sharing data in a data space ecosystem. And with the aim of having on top of these data spaces the possibility to create advanced digital twins in the different municipalities, in the different regions, and of course creating advanced services in many cases relying on the artificial intelligence models. So this is more or less the overall approach that we introduce you from the conceptual perspective. Then we were also explaining you in order to build the data space, which are the essential building blocks that we have identified, and we are being recommended by the Data Spaces Support Center as well on the technical side, because we are focusing here on the technical training. And these building blocks are somehow split into these 3 pillars, one for tackling the data interoperability with proposing some data models capabilities to represent the data, some protocols or APIs for changing actually the data, and some auditing and logging systems for ensuring the provenance and traceability of the data. The second pillar is more focused on sovereignty and trust, where the capabilities that are described in these building blocks have to do with the identity, the attestation of the credentials of the participants in the data space following a decentralized model, also the policies that are needed to be described in order to regulate the access to the data of the participants, and finally to establish a kind of trust framework in the governance of the data space for ensuring the trusty sharing of data. And finally, in the data value creation pillar, and the blueprint is describing here how the data, services, and offerings has to be described in terms of metadata, how this should be published in a catalog, and which are the mechanisms for discovering this data in the catalog. And finally, which type of services can be built around or on top of the data space in order to provide, to manage all these capabilities, like, for example, a marketplace if we want to trade to monetize this sharing. So we presented to you the catalog of specifications of all these building blocks that we have published in our inventory at the DS4SCC website. And then after that, Timo also introduced you why we are mapping or relating to the minimal interoperable mechanisms that are promoted by OASC, which is the mission of these minimal interoperability mechanisms, which is basically to establish which should be the minimal requirements that you need to fulfill in order to be interoperable in the broad sense of the word, and how these means have been defined, which is the structure of these means, which is the standardization activities that are around these means, and how we have been mapping these means into these building blocks that are identified in data space. So these are the current list of means, but these means are evolving towards a new framework in which they have been adapted to the current reality and also to the current needs of the interoperability, especially in the context of data sharing. And these 10 means are being transformed into 9. And with different perspectives, but all of them including how to access the data, how to represent the data, how to link to the data, securing the data, and sharing the data. And on top of these, let's say, steps, we have some cross-cutting aspects of interoperability, which tackle the personal data, the geospatial data, AI, and the local digital twins. So this is an ongoing work. It's something that is being defined in the different means working groups. And from this data space, from the European data space for smart communities, we will be following the upgrading of these means in order to be compliant with all of them. In your proposals, you had to identify which were the means that you were mapping. And well, as essential means for data sharing, we have the NIM 1 and NIM 2 and NIM 6, because we need to define to describe the data, we need to exchange the data, and we need to do this in a secure manner. So that's why you were inquired during the proposal about this mapping with the means. Then after this, we started to present you, which is the approach in terms of architecture for both for the deployment of your own data spaces at your pilot sites, but also the proposal of the federated approach for the European data space for smart communities. In this regards, I put here again the overall conceptual proposed architecture, in which we are assuming, as I said before, that you are leveraging on existing platforms that you have already in your cities, and which are the minimal components that, or the minimal technical actions that you need to do in order to onboard on this European data space for smart communities, but also to deploy your own data space community at your local site. So in the meantime, you can observe here how what I said before, that the different elements of the platform and the data space are always mapping to certain minimal interoperable mechanisms. So we demonstrate that we are following and we are being compliant with the requirements that are provided by these means. And the main idea is that you have to adapt your identity management system in order to integrate which are the policies, the rules that for accessing to the data that you are granting to your participants. And you need to register your participants in a kind of registry where the credentials were available for all the participants in your data space, but also to federate your data space into the European common data, into the European data space for smart communities. This is what is going to happen at your site. On the European data space for smart communities, there will be a kind of instance, central instance, a kind of infrastructure where we will be deploying this registry for all the data spaces federated into the European data space, and a catalog where we will be also federating the metadata descriptions of your data and services. This will require probably also to have a kind of vocabulary hub at the central part with all the data models that can be recognized from for all the data spaces, and that will be accompanying the catalog in order to agree on at least a common language and the mapping between different languages formats of data used in the different data spaces. So this is more or less the overall approach that we were introducing you in the previous session. And also we were describing with some detail which are these three minimal required components that you would need to deploy this kind of repository of credentials of your participants in your data space. That should, or it's recommended to rely on the verifiable credentials in order to follow the decentralized approach for identity management. Then to enlarge, to embed, or to add a plugin to your identity management system with the Authorization Policies Store in order to verify the identity of your participants and the access rights that these participants have over the data that they are in your data space. And finally, as I said, depends in if you are planning to set up also a catalog, a central catalog for your data space, or directly federate to the catalog that we are proposing in a central instance of the data space for smart communities. So I refer to the previous presentations of the previous training for further details on all this. I just wanted to highlight here a few elements of the information provided in the previous session. We were also discussing about the usage of connectors, because instead of deploying components in isolated manner, there exists this possibility of using existing connectors, which are a suite of components that are including all these facilities for facilitating the onboarding of the data spaces and participants into data spaces. And here it was just one example of the capabilities that a connector may have. which includes authentication, authorization, the possibility, the capabilities for data exchange, the contract management, and publication mechanisms in the catalog. So this is a bit, well, we will be working together to identify if it's easier. First, go through the step of trying to deploy and validate the individual components, and then trying to validate a connector as a whole, or we can decide maybe going directly with the connector facility. So it's still to be defined. Yeah. Then when you were requested by well to provide where would you like to deep dive, you highlighted these 2 points. One is how to implement the current legal framework, and how to implement the data transaction between the participants. So I have elaborated a little bit on these 2 points right now. So we will go through them now. So regarding the first point, the legal framework implementation, as I said before, I'm not an expert in the legislation and regulation, but I learned from my colleagues of the Data Spaces Support Center, which are very much skilled on that, and I have tried to bring you here some knowledge from the DSCC about this part of how to implement legal framework. So first, I would like to refer to some of the sources that they have created for defining a little bit the scope of the legal frameworks in relation to data spaces. So here you can see that they have split these legal frameworks into different perspectives. The first one is everything in relation to data acts, data regulation. And here we may have on one side the already well-known personal data legislation, like the GDPR, for example. Also other legislation for non-personal data, but very, let's say, in the scope of the public sector, which is the Open Data Directive or the High Value Data Sets Act. And then other new data legislation that came a few years ago, like the Data Governance Act, the Data Act or Interoperable Europe Act. And of course, the upcoming, the recent AI Act. This is in regards to the data, but apart from the data legislation, we have other regulations that are also in the scope of data spaces. For example, about the intellectual property rights, the copyright, the trade secrets. At the time that you are going to share data, you need to be careful if all these data or services are under certain IT regulation. You may also have some regulation in regards to platforms, like the Digital Market Act or the Digital Service Act, for example. You may have also some competition law that maybe affect to the data that you are sharing, maybe not so much on the public sector, but this is more in the case for data sharing in private sector. And of course, we need to be compliant with all the trust and security regulation from the Cyber Resilience Act, NIS2 Directive, European Digital Identity Regulation that we have mentioned before. And apart from that, we may have some legislation that is specific for a certain domain, for a certain sector. And this is very depending on the type of data that is being shared and the type of stakeholders, which is the domain where these stakeholders are trying to share data. And of course, on the private side, there exists also legislation for the contracts, for the contracts between participants in the data space. So this is a kind of, let's say, landscape of regulation that may be in the scope of data spaces. If we want to know which out of this regulation is affecting really my data space, we have to define or to identify which are my triggers. So first, I need to analyze which is the data that I'm trying to share. Is this data personal data? Is this data under certain intellectual property restrictions? Is held by public sector? So depends on the answers of these questions. As one or another legislation, it's required to be followed. Another trigger is the type of participants in my data space. So are the participants in my data space public or private? Which are the roles that they are playing? Are they data intermediaries? Are they platform providers? Are they research organizations, public sector? So depending on the role, this may trigger one or another legislation as well. And finally, which is the domain where my data space is running. So in our case, it's public sector in general, but not only, because the smart communities data space is very much cross-domain. So we may have some legislation from mobility, for example, affecting to the data space, because some of the use cases that you are proposing are in the mobility environment. Is environmental domain, because we are getting information from environment and also measuring some of this impact into the city or into the region. So I mean, it's a bit let's say challenging in the case of smart communities data space, because it's a very much cross-domain data space. So then, once you have the answers of these questions, you may start to think how to, or which are the consequences, the technical consequences of applying one or another legislation. So here are some examples of what does it mean to apply certain regulation or to implement certain regulation from a technical point of view. So, for example, in the case of GDPR, because we are dealing with personal data, we should set up a kind of data privacy vocabulary, and that this impacts directly into the identity and attestation management building block. If we are thinking, because we are public sector and we need to follow the Open Data Directive, we need to consider the usage of open formats for data descriptions and the use of high quality metadata in order to describe properly and use and in a useful manner the data and services. And this affects directly to the data models, to the publication and discovery in the catalog, and to the descriptions of the data services and offerings. For example, as I said, if we are considering that some of our use cases are in the scope of the mobility, maybe we need to follow the ITS directive in mobility, which requires to have high quality and timely data available for services. So how do we do this? By using real-time APIs for the data exchange and auditing and tracing the provenance of the data. For example, in the Data Act, there is an article, the 33, which is mandating interoperability in the context of data spaces through harmonized standards. So, which affects directly to the agreements on data models, on APIs for data exchange, and policies or rules for provenance and traceability. And finally, another example, if we want to implement the European Digital Identity Framework, we need to look at the usage of verifiable credentials, which is the standard that it is relying on, and this affects again to the identity and attestation management. So these are just examples of how different regulation can be implemented technically speaking, and we can be somehow have our checklist if we are really fulfilling with all the requirements given by the regulation. But if you think that other legislation, apart from the ones that we have mentioned, needs to be analyzed, please let us know. If we are able to make it at the scope of our data space, because it's domain specific, we can, with the colleagues working on the legal part of the blueprint, we can work on it. We can even organize a joint training session between the legal and the technical, and we can go deeper into these technical implementations of the legislation. And if it is general legislation that we need to apply, we can also request the Data Spaces Support Center for further analysis and feedback about how to implement. Another point that you were raising as in order to make a deep dive is about the data transaction implementation, how this should be implemented, following all the steps. And here I took, or I leveraged on the work that is been doing in the Trusted Data Transaction workshop at the Sensenelec standardization group. They are working on defining exactly what does it mean a data transaction, and which are the different stages and steps that you need to follow in order to make a proper and secure data transaction between two parties. I brought here first the scope of what they call data transaction, which, as you can see, has the data product at the core. So I mean, as a central point of this transaction. So what you are really exchanging or sharing is a data product, which includes not only the data itself, but also should include certain license terms in order to explicitly say which are the usage rights or the usage terms that you have in regards to this product. And that normally this product is published in a data catalog, is referenced in a data usage contract, and is used in a data transaction. So here you can see the different roles. You have who has produced the data, who is providing the data, which sometimes is not the same person or the same role, and the user that is requesting the data. So it's the data transaction is triggered by this data user, which is requesting access to certain data, and then this requires to set up a kind of negotiation previous to the data transaction itself, in order to agree on the terms of this transaction. But previously to that, this data has to be published and has to be able to be discovered by someone. And the access rights has to be established before the transaction itself. So that's why the transaction has 3 different phases. The first one is the provisional phase. It's a kind of offline work to be done before the data transaction. In this phase, you need to determine the rights and the access rights to the data. You need to publish the data product in certain catalog, as I said before, by using certain type of metadata. The better metadata you are describing, the better your data product is discovered, and the policies to access this data. So it's a kind of back office work that you need to do before you establish a data transaction or you launch a data transaction. Then once all this is in place, you need to negotiate the agreement between the provider and the user of this data. And normally this is called the data uses contract. And then once the contract is already agreed, you can really start to do the transactions. And this, in some cases, could be sharing the data. In other cases, could be exchange the data, because there is a small difference between the term data exchange and data sharing. So that's why I keep both here in this phase.
Sharing is continuous, right? And exchange is basically a one-time thing. Can we think about it? Yeah.
Yeah, it's also for me the difference that in data exchange, for me, the data is really flying from one side to another one, from the provider to the user, while sharing for me is more the data is remaining at the place where the data is originally from, and you are granted access to this data for having a look at it or for getting some information, but you are not really moving the data anywhere. Okay. So it's a small, let's say, difference. And but in the general context, they are used sometimes interchangeably. Okay, so these are the three phases. So if we go to the specific interactions, or let's say, yeah. So how in the context of a data provider, data user, or how this is transferred, or which are the different interactions that are happening between one data space or another data space, one provider and the user, one participant and another participant. So imagine that you have two participants in the left and the right part. Beforehand, all this happening, you need to have all the credentials already registered for all the participants. You need to have all the data in the catalog here below according to the certain common vocabulary. And then it's always good to distinguish between the control plane and the data plane. The control plane is where the, let's say, transaction is agreed and is negotiated. The data product is in the catalog. The negotiation of the access to the data is already agreed, and the transfer mechanisms are already set up. And once all of this is already agreed and in place, you can really move to the data plane where the data exchange or sharing is happening in the end. So it's happening actually. So these are the two levels of the data transaction implementation in terms of interaction phases or stages. So you can find this with more details in the DSSC blueprint where it's described as an introduction of the technical building blocks. And finally, if you want to concrete this into practical steps, during the provisional phase, you need to define the policies in the Authorization Policies Store, normally using ODRL implemented through RICO. You have to describe the metadata for the data and services to be shared in the catalog by using DCAT recommended. Then register the participants' credentials in the Universal Registry relying on verifiable credentials, and publish the metadata descriptions into the catalog at your data space or into the Federated catalog at the European data space. In the negotiation phase, you need to establish the contract terms between the provider and the users, not only from the legal perspective, but also implement this contract through technical mechanisms for putting this contract in place. Here, you can use existing APIs like the ones provided by TM Forum, for example. And then you need also to agree on the data models and the APIs that you are planning to use for the actual data exchange or data sharing, or determining the mapping mechanisms between the two sides. Because if you are using different data models or different APIs, at certain point for exchanging or for sharing the data, you need to map both sides to understand each other. And finally, during the data sharing or exchange phase, you need to, as I explained in the previous session, you have several steps to follow. But basically, in summary, you need to validate the credentials of the participant that is requesting or initiating the data transaction. and then to exchange or share the data depending on the terms of the contract and the standards that you have agreed for data and for APIs. So this is more or less the different steps that you need to follow in the different phases of a data transaction as such. So is it clear? Is it understandable? Okay. Okay, good. So any further question? I have put here some additional materials that I think that if you have time during, I mean during Christmas or in your free time, there are some recent community webinars from Fireware that have been issued and with some videos and presentations that are describing all these steps, all these, let's say, so independently of the technology or of the standards and so on, I think that they are good for, let's say, being guided through how to set up this decentralized identity or this contract negotiation. And also they provided a reference use case for exemplifying all this process of being on board into a data space and the different requirements that you need to take into account. And of course, you can always navigate through the SSC blueprint, which is also describing some of these specific elements in the building blocks. It's not very much different from what we already told you in the, or Timo told you in the building blocks descriptions, because in this data space we are following more or less the SSC blueprint as well. But I mean, as just for literature, if you are curious, you can also navigate through that.